takes a lot of time to tell someone's personal story. And if you think that's the case, pick a soldier, walk down to Indian Mountain and throw a rock, find one, and then figure out everything he did. It's challenging. It's very challenging. There's a lot more resources out there to help you do that today than there was probably when the first Hanging Rock Rebel book came out.
Amen to that.
Okay? There's probably a lot more resources out there today than there were in 1905 when you had to drive around in a buggy and find everybody and put the storyline together. So, I'm grateful for that part, because that part's made me find this information a little bit more quickly. Obviously today, some of you have looked through, I was approached after the last presentation that I did about a document. And obviously the last presentation I did was about bottles and the people of Romney who worked in the pharmacy business and the dairy business and the bottling business that contributed to bottles that existed that had Romney on them. And obviously Corbett's drugstore becomes one of those stores that I've begun the research project on, and because of this document I now know way more than I could print in any book about Corbett's in terms of how that business came to be. One of the first questions that I had to ask was, number one, does it make sense? Number two, does everything fit together? So what I did is I went out, took a look at the document. Let's see if this thing's going to work. If not, I got to punch up here every time. And there was a book. This is Elwood's Stories of the Ringgold Cavalry, written by John Elwood, who was one of the original Ringgold soldiers. This book was published in 1914. Okay, so we're looking how many years after the end of the war. So again, a book that told the story from the Ringolds inside out. So I opened up the book, and as I sat with the people that I was working with on the project, and I'll be the first to tell you, it's Pam and Mark, why can't I forget your name? Had the documents in the book, and we sat down and went through each of the documents, and they're like, I'm really excited, this is cool, John Elwood's book, it's old, and so we started going through, and the first thing that came out were some tax receipts that had Mary Corbett's name on them, which are here. Like, oh, that's cool, this adds up to the storyline, and then we go a little bit further, and then the Parker House Hotel receipts show up in the book, and they're like, so then the third one shows up, and that's the discharge paper for John T. Corbett, and that's really where this whole thing begins. As we begin the story, how did the Corbett name end up in Romney? And how did your name end up in Romney? If you're a Hott or a Lewis or a Haynes, or you eventually came to Romney for some reason. Those names are very popular, but how did the name Corbett end up in Romney? And that's where this quest becomes to validate that document and begin the process of research. So that's kind of how this all begins. And I call this presentation The Secret Keeper, because how many of you have been to an auction and watched a box of books get sold? Yeah. Auctioneers, they're tough people, and there could be a gun inside of a book. Actually, when they said it was inside of a book, I'm like, oh, this is a gun, because they cut it out and stored their, Derringer. Maybe it was my grandmother's Derringer. I don't know what was in the book, but, people store stuff in the book. And, if you don't at auctions go through books, who knows what you're going to burn or throw away. And I would hate to have seen any of this material, and Pam and Mark would have hated to have seen any of this material that's on this table. Number one, leave Hampshire County. Number two, get destroyed. Because there's a lot of factual things that are here that tie into the daily operations of the town of Romney from the Civil War all the way up through. One of those, there's two ringers here. One of them is the tax receipts for this building are for Taggart Hall. How do you know that? You have to take the town lot that they were paid for. Everyone refers to that as the Hill House. We'll figure out how that all works out too. As you find out that our drugstore, John Paxson Corbett owner, his wife and B.W. Hill's wife were sisters. And their father was Mr. DeBerry, who was the superintendent of schools at West Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind. Okay, and so the Hill House we refer to it as the Hill House, but in 1911 it was the Mary Corbett House. So, these kind of things tell a story, and so every piece here has, a face behind the name. My job is to be able to take this and turn it into the storyline, and that's where the rubber hits the road. We went through steel wheels all the way up through brand new rubber treads, and I've burned those off 3 times and got new sets of tires in this research, getting it from point A to point B. So we're going to talk about that. Obviously, there's your receipts for the Parker House Hotel. They were preserved. Several of them are for the hotel. One of them is for a tobacco license. Take a look at them. And you just walked in and said that it was under new management, J.P. Corbett, 1896. So that's an important document for me as we match these things up, for sure. And those are, you really get to learn that microfiche down at the library too. Again, all those receipts are in Mary Corbett's. Of course, this is a discharge paper. It's February of 1864. It is a Union discharge paper. It was signed in Cumberland, Maryland, which is the place of the discharge. We'll talk about that as we get there. It indicated the 22nd Pennsylvania Ringgold Cavalry. And then John T. Corbett, and he was a farmer by trade, which for me, makes it that much more interesting. At the last presentation, Charlie Hall mentioned that there was a grave at Indian Mound Cemetery of a Union soldier. His last name was Corbett. Would they be related? And so, thus, the quest becomes to match the two up. All right. So I give Charlie the ups on knowing his history that night. Washington, Pennsylvania is where he enlisted and where he's from. One of the things about Washington, Pennsylvania, if you look at history, I kind of paint, because again, I'm in the business of people, so I'm trying to paint the picture for you, is that they were a major player in the Underground Railroad. This is a picture of what is known as the Lemoyne House. The Lemoyne House was a registered site on the Underground Railroad, and moving slaves to and from what they would consider that marking point between there and Canada, and getting those people into New York, freed slaves. So obviously a lot of the people in Washington, Pennsylvania would be very northern and sympathizing. You can see the soldiers leaving town in this painting, this interpretation. What I want to create is a little foreshadowing. And it's very hard for you to see, but if you know this painting, you will see a soldier right here. And you will see a young girl right here. Okay? He is throwing her a love letter in a rock. Okay? And if you know that painting, and you can see that painting is very popular, in the Civil War side of things. And that's going to create some of the culture of this specific presentation. It happens to be Dr. Lemoyne's daughter. And adds that romantic side to the war itself. So that's just a little bit about where he's from. The Ringgold Cavalry enlisted April 13th, 1861. Obviously, we look at the Fort Sumter. That's the big start of the Civil War. It hit Washington, Pennsylvania via telegraph. All right? The Confederates had bombed Fort Sumter, and obviously key terms here that we need to know as we go through Romney too. Railroad, telegraph, news traveling. Those are things that you want to soak up in your head. Captain John Keyes had thought that he would answer President Lincoln's quest for 75,000 troops. And so by going to Harrisburg and speaking to Governor A.G. Curtin, offering his cavalry, who were trained and had continued to train after the Mexican War, for Mr. Lincoln to use in the war, and the governor said no, only cavalry. Okay, and so of course he goes back to Washington, Pennsylvania, and they're like, "You mean they don't want our horsemen? What's the deal? We were trained, we're ready. Why don't they want us?" And since the end of the Mexican War, again, they're named after Major Samuel Ringgold, who had been trained, drilling, and preparing for any call of duty. They had their own horses, they had their own guns, and they had their own equipment. Okay, so it's made sense that they would be the ones. So for the second time, John Keyes goes back to the governor in Harrisburg. So if you're picturing above Morgantown, to Harrisburg is right in the middle of the state, roughly. Considerable travel time to say, hey, we want to do this thing. We're ready. We're trained, we're prepared. And they were turned down a second time. So, everybody's kind of like, hey, we really want to get a part of this war effort. You're going to give us a little small chunk of the pie. We're ready to go. So he wrote a letter to the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron at the time, and guess what Simon Cameron said? Hey, we love it, but we're not really interested in the cavalry. 3 times they were denied coming to war. So Simon, and one of the things you have to understand is people and connections. So what occurs here is he finds out through the talk of the town that his father and Simon became very good friends when they built the national road through Washington, Pennsylvania. And that, Mr. Simon had always ate at their house, was with their dad, and, had that conversation of, hey, young pup, if you ever need a favor, I'm your guy, cash it in, you're a good one. Well, that's exactly what he did. He got a hold of him. He used the card. We always say holding that card. He used that card, and the Ringgold Cavalry was accepted. So, that's how it kind of gets started. This is the enlistment spot on June 22nd of 1861. They gathered at the National Hotel in Bellsville. I don't know if you've done any research on National Hotel. Do yourself a favor and type that in. There's like 5 million of them. They're like Holiday Inns, I think. If anybody has anything to add on that, but there's national hotels everywhere. And they're pretty elaborate for their time period and how they were constructed. That's where they signed their enlistment papers. They were checked for physical condition and evaluated, and their horses were appraised. 70 men total enlisted in the original, what they call the original Ringgold soldiers, and we'll talk about how they change a little bit. Due to the nature of the enlistment, however, Secretary Cameron handled the appointment without government clearance. And they operated the first 3 years of the war without being fully recognized by the government. That shows up as we talk about John T. Corbett's military records. There's very few talk prior to 1864, 3 in that official record, because we aren't really sure where you are. Okay? So, that makes things a little bit tough in terms of research. They were discharged, however, in 1864, which is the first piece of information that follows the discharge paper, that they were given the opportunity to discharge. And we'll talk about that discharge when we get there. However, they were penciled in under the 22nd Pennsylvania Cavalry. And if you look at the documents that I have, every single one of them, they've marked out the 22nd Pennsylvania, or marked out Cavalry, or marked out the Cavalry, and they put in Ringgold every single time. It's like a bond of brothers all the way through the war, how they kept everything that way. And they did some things that were a little more non-conditional to government things. We talked about burying soldiers and things like that too. Any questions about this before we go on? What I will say is, what does Washington, Pennsylvania offer in terms of war supplies? And this is kind of the important part. Where's the resources going to come from to have a war? We go to Food Line every day and get our food. We flush our toilet and then everything goes away. We go get gas at Sheets. All right? We're talking about horses that have to be fed. We're talking about soldiers that have to be fed. We're talking about wagons that have to be built. Ammunition and guns. And Washington, Pennsylvania has a lot to offer, especially in their foundries. And they felt like they were protecting their homelands because of all the resources that were there. If the South had gotten into those foundries, it really would have messed up a lot of resources for the government. And of course, Pittsburgh's right there close by. It provided the second most horses to the war. Pennsylvania did. Again, it's an agricultural area. It's an agricultural breeding area, and so therefore the horses become very, very, very important. It is farm country, it's fertile agricultural ground, and it obviously was a place where there was an abundance of food. All these things require transportation, okay, to get from point A to point B, and the railroad becomes a big part of that in the building and maintaining and keeping it open. Especially here, you know, through this whole Ringgold, McNeil, you can throw all the names you want, General Kelly, you can throw them all. The main purpose is keep that railroad running for supply purposes, and Washington, Pennsylvania is one of those targets on the map that they need to get to in order to get supplies. So, you know, again, there's a picture of wartime period of what Washington, one of the Washington foundries would have looked like on the top there. They were moved to Philippi, which is where they were mustered in on June 3rd of 1861. And again, there was a night attack on Philippi. Actually, they were moved to Grafton. Hold that thought. They were moved to Grafton. June 3rd of 1861 was the night attack on Philippi. For those of you that have studied that with Colonel Benjamin Kelly. It's the first, you know, major invasion of southern soil by the Union Army. One of two wounded Confederates, James Hanger, who was wounded in the Battle of Philippi, became very prominent for his production of prosthetic legs. The Hanger Company is still in business today. I think it has 70-some sites in the United States for building prosthesis. And that Confederate soldier was wounded in Philippi, created his own prosthesis, and as a result could not go back to war, but was shipped off to create his own, you know, for the Confederate Army to develop prosthetic limbs and splints and things during the war. Obviously becomes his business. General Kelly obviously is wounded in this battle, becoming one of the first individuals shot right underneath the breastbone and out through the scapula, something that he fought with during the entire war in terms of, you know, getting better. I will mention, this is a piece of local history because again I'm about people making connections. General Kelly gets the famous horse Philippi after this battle. This is something I want to do a little more research on because I'm an animal science teacher, you know, and we killed how many horses in the Civil War. But you might want to note the history of David Arnold, who is from Junction, who is credited with stealing General Kelly's horse in the raid on Cumberland when the generals were taken out of their sleep. The noble black stallion Philippi was stolen. He ends up giving it to an officer in Virginia because he felt the horse was way too much for a private to own. Pretty fancy horse. After the war, and there is a document here on the table, this one. This is a document that I found that covers the lawsuit over that horse. General Kelly filed $250, what they call it, restitution for the horse being stolen during the war. And the case is filed in Mineral County. Of course, General Kelly lived in Garrett County at the time. The Arnolds lived in Mineral County. The sympathizers of the government in Mineral County were too divided versus Confederate and Union, so they shipped all the cases to Kingwood, to Preston County to be tried. And it talks about in here the day that Mr. Arnold was finally called to court over the issue, was at the Piedmont station, was going to Rollsburg, and the train master stuck his head out and said, "Hey, you can go back to your home." They burnt the courthouse down in Kingwood and all the records with it. So there were tons of cases, and you can get into a whole new group of history on that by researching all the cases that were filed against Confederates after the war for property damage and restitution, and most of those, including this one, no official record that they were ever paid for that money. The Arnold House is somewhere in Junction. Anybody familiar with where that house is? Apparently a very prominent home. Anybody know? Yeah. Something else for me to go track down. Yeah. Oakland, Maryland, that becomes the first spot for the Ringgolds to move. And I kind of picture this wonderful little experience. You know, they're all in Grafton hanging out. The Battle of Philippi's over. Everybody comes back to Grafton. And the Ringgolds are there, and they're jonesing to get going to fight a war, and our horses, you know, are all riled up and everything. And so the Ringgolds have been commissioned to go to Oakland. As a result of going to Oakland, they described that experience as more parade-like. Horses were put on the train, okay? Got them all bedded down in the train, and the soldiers got on the train, and you know, where some of them were setting up on top, and some of them were on the front, and off to Oakland we're going to go. Because apparently on the National Pike there's been a lot of confusion outside of Oakland that we need to manage. The goal again was to intercept the troops. This becomes their first official responsibilities, is to intercept the troops on their retreat from Rich Mountain. That in itself is a whole battle that you can research and go over. They went to camp at the Red House Hotel. Unfortunately, as they arrived at the camp, they could see from a distance, fleeing off into the east, the back end of that guard. They missed them. They just missed them. And they received a second order, and as a result, you know, were able to capture that second group of people that were able to come through. And it really becomes their first minor engagement of the war. Anybody have any questions? Anyone? The Ringgold Cavalry have now been, after being returned to Grafton in July, they're moved to New Creek. They returned to Grafton on July 24th. They escorted General Reynolds and the Federal Paymaster. They returned on June 30th to Grafton. On August 25th, they were ordered to New Creek by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. So again, off of the mountain they come. You know, they're kind of doing a little reconnaissance work. And probably a lot of that is we're not really sure about how this war is going to unfold. Some of it is, hey, let's see how good they are. So they were doing a lot of little escorting things. And as you find out in the war, they do a lot of that too as they continue. So it was little short things out and back. But New Creek, for those of you who aren't familiar with Civil War, this was a tough one for me because I know where New Creek is as a person, but that was Kaiser until the name change took place. So we're dealing, and it looked very different. There's the camp at New Creek, Kaiser, you know, Fort Piano. Some of you know where Potomac State is, and probably know that history a little better than I. But the bottom land there near New Creek was cleared. There wasn't a lot there. Today there's everything there in the floodplain, but in those days it was open fields and farmland. Obviously New Creek entering in the Potomac there. They had really two responsibilities by going to New Creek, and that was one, to protect the B&O Railroad. Piedmont's a booming area. I know it's really hard to think about today. I collect a lot of stuff from Piedmont, hopefully to preserve some form of history before the whole town falls down. But you know, Piedmont was a booming area. It was that last straight haul up before they went up the mountain, and you know, later on two railroads are coming through there at the same time, Western Maryland and B&O, and so it was a booming area. Kaiser begins to grow, but really their job is to keep that B&O Railroad going. You know, it's going to climb the mountain once it gets to Piedmont and keep things functioning. And of course, the other part of it is that rebel cavalry. They knew that, you know, the area was Southern sympathizing in nature, and as a result, you know, they would end up, you know, with this rebel type of behavior that would occur. And again, a lot of that was embedded in the culture, and we'll talk about that as we get a little closer. The first major battle for the Ringgold Cavalry, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through, and then there's going to be a part where something occurs, okay? And then I have to go back and match Corbett up, okay? So at this point, we're talking about the whole unit. So you, in your head, you can say Corbett was there or Corbett wasn't there. But as far as the Ringgold Cavalry unit, these are the things that they did, okay? Some of them I know exactly where he's at because of that document. And we'll talk about those as we get there. So we'll talk about Ringgolds as Ringgolds, and then we'll talk about John Corbett as a Ringgold. Does everybody understand that? So there's going to be, and again, there's going to be a little bit of this, 20 of them went this direction and 20 of them went this direction. I can't tell you which 20 he's in. I just kind of got to cover what they do. Some of them I can tell you exactly where he is because of what happened in that document. General Kelly ordered the movement of the 4th Ohio and Ringgold Cavalry from New Creek on September 23rd. And 2 miles prior to Mechanicsburg Gap at midnight, they encountered the Southern picket. They fired on the picket and then they retreated. Okay, this is where they find Romney for the first time. They start to talk about, Union influence in Romney. This is where it starts to get a little shaky as they start to get here. Captain Samuel Myers, CSA. You got to watch the Myerses too, because there's Myerses that are Union soldiers and there's Myerses that are Confederate soldiers. So I'll try to use their first name or indicate afterward that they're Confederate or Union soldiers so that you can match it up. Because Henry Myers is a great Union, sergeant who does a lot of work too. So don't get them mixed up. Well, they were were sent to Hanging Rock Pass. So as soon as they see them come into town, they say, get to Hanging Rock Pass. Now, for those of you who don't know where Hanging Rock Pass is, that's where we would commonly talk about the Roeder farm on the turn, rocks overhead as you would go down into the road that would take you into the bottom, which would be, if you went far enough, would get you into the Shaw property, the Washington farm, or prior to that down into the Harriet property. Okay? And there is a ford that comes off of Fox's Hollow that allows you to attack that more from a westward front, which is kind of how the Union Army gets to this point. But the Confederate Army from that rock can see up pretty much all the way to Romney. You can see, especially as it's not as grown up as it would be today. They gathered the troops east of town who could move in either direction as needed. Okay, so the Confederates kind of had control of the situation. The Ringgolds attacked at the pass first, to no avail. Because if you've been to Mechanicsburg Gap, it's wall-to-wall mountains with a stream in the middle. So Cantwell divided the Union Army, sending some to Hanging Rock Pass, and some stayed at the Mechanicsburg Gap. As they moved in the fog, again, this is the other thing, we don't have flashlights and modern hunting gear to do this like we would today. You have to deal with the weather, you have to deal with the fog. They make it to Hanging Rock Pass. As they moved in the fog, the Confederates opened fire as they come across the river and up into that. If you've ever been there, the train track is there, as it would be today. And then there's a small road pass. And once you're there, there's not a whole lot of places for you to go other than in the river. And if it's anywhere like it would have been today, it's a considerable fall even to the river. So they got cut off at that pass. What I can tell you is that they were turned back around. The rocks, they threw guns off, they fired off until their guns wouldn't go off, and they threw rocks off onto the soldiers. So you can imagine, a rock this size coming off a cliff as high as Hanging Rock down into that area. So the Ringgolds, of course, retreat as best they can, whoever's with them, back across the river, and they come up what we would consider the north or west side of the river. And I use the reference John Dan Sitar's farm across the river, and they're seen, but to no avail at Hanging Rock. Now there was a prominent Ringgold, we'll talk about John Elwood. It says Angling Rock, but John Elwood, who is this guy, his horse was one of the casualties at Hanging Rock. His horse was shot, so he had to jump on with somebody else, and so I can imagine the carnage of leaving dead things around. It's one of the issues in major battles, but in rural battles like we had, who knows, you come up on a dead horse, who knows what would be laying on it or eating it, it becomes an issue. The next day, the Union forces had retreated, but only to Mechanicsburg Gap. The Confederate forces retreated to Church Hill. Church Hill, I presume. Anybody want to take a shot?
Ebenezer.
Ebenezer, that was what I would presume. That would be Church Hill. Is that correct? Out of town? I don't know. That's why I'm asking. Probably Ebenezer. And then there were a few exchanges of shots as they returned to their post. And on September 25th, the Union Army entered Romney for the first time and immediately destroyed the printing press of the South Branch Intelligencer. It was one of the things they were told to do because of the Southern sympathizing community and the papers that had been written that were so biased. The 7th Virginia mounted an attack on the Union retreat was made back to New Creek after accomplishing the goal of destroying the press. So it becomes a who saw who first, who got here first, who moved here first. We're going to see that a lot in terms of timing. We don't have drones that can, in the Civil War, that can fly up there and say, oh, we got 500 of them. They send a scout, and the scout comes flying back. You better get things together or leave what you have and go on about your business. So this becomes their first presence in Romney, and those stories have been told quite some time. Does anybody have anything to add to that, as far as from a Ringgold or Union perspective?
It was the first time the soldiers in Romney or in the area had ever been fired on at that point. They didn't know what to do. When the Yankees started firing back up on the mountain, that was the first time they'd ever been under fire, and they were scared to death.
I'm sure that's probably why it took them to get to...
Yeah.
I think we're going to go down here a little bit further.
There was no glory that day.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Wasn't John Blue involved in
Yeah,
that
he was
engagement?
up there, and yeah, it was...
And that would have been close to his home.
Right, yeah, just right up the road from his house, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things I find is in terms of geographical location, they didn't have a pedometer or a speedometer to tell them it's 5 miles, go 5 miles. They didn't know that distance very well. And as they begin to document things, especially 30 years after it happened or 40 years after it happened, they're a little gray in terms of distance, and to try to figure out where things are, you got to shift things and move things around. As far as back into Romney, one of my coolest pictures or pencil sketches is the Romney suspension bridge, or Springfield suspension bridge is one of my favorites. Obviously a bridge that was there until, 32, I believe, the flood.
Wire bridge.
A wire bridge, yeah. And you can see how it has that, cable support type system. Jennifer, back in Romney, as far as when they're coming back, Winifred Scott issued an order to assume the command of Romney. They assembled all the available troops on October 23rd to proceed to Romney. The second command was to come from the north as a diversion via the wire bridge. So we're going to send them in 2 directions and see if we can get them to chase each other around. One of the things that the Confederate soldiers did was they removed the flooring of the bridge. It's hard to get across the bridge with people, and so the boards were all tore up. So when they got to the bridge, the main assault, the Ringgold Cavalry passed the Southern pickets and got their way to Mechanicsburg. A series of strategic moves by the cavalry and the infantry was made, and they made their way into Cemetery Hill. Of course, we would most commonly associate that with Indian Mound. The Ringolds scoured the streets and captured the remains of Colonel McDonald's supplies and horses. So they were able to move around. I don't think they ever made it across that suspension bridge. I think they had to spend too much time, but I think the diversion of troops to come say, hey, they're here, took away from that ability to protect the town. But the suspension bridge will come back up, or the wire bridge. I'll get it right.
Did you notice, Isaac, it says, under the caption for the sketch, it says, on his retreat to Cumberland, Virginia?
Yeah, that's a big mismark for sure,
Yeah.
what that original would be worth. What I would talk about at this point, again, because of the people, what was Romney's social life like? And we'll talk about this. I hope my slides aren't in order. I had a student look at this thing and hope they didn't move them around. But what was the social life like in the town during this, upheaval? The first major victory of the Union was in Romney carried a little clout. They received extra men. General Lander offered support to maintain the morale and the victory of Romney. They camped at the western end of town, was named Camp Keys. I'm not sure where that is either. I'm sure someone can pick me.
I think that was on the campus of the School for the
Definitely.
Deaf.
Named after the Ringgold Battalion, because they were so valiant. And of course, the cannon that they got when they got into town, the one that pulls apart, that they could travel by 3 horses and was given to them as a gift. General Kelly issued a proclamation back home and to support the citizens of Hampshire County who said, hey, come on back, as long as you're friendly. We have that here, you can read it. Come on back to Hampshire County, as long as you support the Union cause and, love the Union Army, you can come back and just take up shop. And, one of the things that they found was that the hotel in town, which at that point in time would have been the Virginia House Hotel, is that correct? That would have been General Kelly's, would it have been the Parker in the Civil War? Where was General Kelly's headquarters when he was in Romney? I was told the Virginia House Hotel, but I don't know where that is.
I think that was on the, and I'm just, what I've heard, was on the corner where the Rite Aid is now, in that part of that.
But that would that have been, eventually would have been the Parker House?
Wasn't the Parker House on up the?
No.
No, it was their Rite
So
Aid.
that may have been the same.
So
construction.
maybe they just called it something different
Yeah.
then. But all that he had was Confederate money. And he was willing to give it all away for some Union money so he could do business with their occupation, because he had all this Confederate money he couldn't do anything with. What that would be worth today. Many of them fled town. We're getting out of Dodge. We're picking up our stuff and we're getting out of here. We're not real sure how this is going to end for us. And we'll talk about some people that probably stayed in town. In November, General Kelly's old regiment came to Romney. They were the first Virginia Regiment, and later 1st West Virginia Regiment. In the midst of the summer camp environment, the town was still visibly damaged by the war. Pretty rough. But when Kelly's regiment came to town, his original regiment that he fought with in Philippi, the band came. We're coming through town just like a parade. That in itself is a whole different side of the research you could get into. Even though the remaining women in town were seckish, or sexist, okay? And strayed away from the men in blue, all right? So, again, some people have to stay. That's part of this. We see that in wars today. Some people can't, flee. They're going to stay. And so that was part of how things are going to work. So let's talk about that for a second. Gertrude Poling was 15 years old when the Union Army came to town. Okay? She was the daughter of Joseph W. Poling, who at that time was 52 years old. Her mother was Elizabeth Poling, who was 47. Joseph W. Poling was born in Cresaptown, Maryland. Okay? We soaked this up in terms of creating the picture. They lived on Courthouse Lane. Okay? If you look at the 1860 census, they lived right about, in terms of those of you that would remember the beautiful building that sat right here, that was right beside the Hill House. It was called had the printing presses that were destroyed. What's that building called? The Workman Building.
Oh, Workman.
Right?
Yeah.
Guess who their neighbors were? The Workmans. There was a blacksmith shop behind that. Okay? And there were some guys who stayed in that blacksmith shop, who worked in that blacksmith shop. We'll talk about them here in a second. James W. Poling is a brother. She had 11 siblings, by the way. As best that I can check. Okay? One of those siblings is James W. Poling, 25, a carpenter. He was a member of Company K, Hampshire Guards, 13 Virginia Infantry. 13 Virginia. So he's with J.W. Poling as a comrade in the same infantry. Many of you in here probably could go over the Hampshire Guard and the Frontier Riflemen as a predecessor to the war, local security type of infantry. So these guys were already familiar with some things. I don't know that they drilled or did things like that, but they were organized, and I'm sure there's other people in here can talk a little bit more about that in terms of that. But let me see if I can switch to this one. Love technology. When in doubt, always bring them back up. All right, so 2 brothers, father's a jailer, neighbor guy who's 23, blacksmith. All right, everybody soaked that up? All right, good. So that brings us to the first engagement. They're here. Things are happening. Let's hope this one comes up and I can hit function F8 and life will go on.
So as far as you know, Corbett was here at that time.
As far as I can tell.
I mean,
We're going to find out for real quickly, yes. But speculating that the Ringgold Cavalry as a unit were here. And then we have to play sleuth a little bit with the documents and find out, some other things as we go on. Hopefully this will come up. I'm trying to not drag this out. Basically, what occurs at Frenchburg, the first part of it is that the Ringgold Cavalry pickets are set up there, and as a result, 2 of the infantrymen decide to borrow the horses from 2 cavalrymen and go to Miss French's store to get them a little bit of extra things that she may have to sell there, which could be food or tobacco or whatever it might be. As we know, Sheets is a very common and Confederate name here. Him and his unit were watching them as they did this several days, and as a result, ambushed the 2 infantrymen on horses and took their horses, and as a result, now you have a dilemma. So the 2 Ringgolds decide that they're going to go figure out why their horses aren't coming back. Bain and Buckingham are the 2 Ringgolds. They're outlined well in the books about Ringgold soldiers. Went to see what was going on, and as they turned the corner, they were attacked, and Bain escaped. Buck was taken, what they call Buck, which was Buckingham, was taken prisoner. It becomes one of those discussions in the Ringgold Cavalry of who was fast and who was slow. And as a result, they lose horses, they lose a soldier. On May 28, 1862, he was traded and sent to New York City to be examined and returned to duty, actually. So he didn't stay in a Confederate prison during the entire war. But there was a holdover area in New York City. He was taken there and was held, examined, make sure he was okay, good health, and then was sent back to Washington, Pennsylvania, and then was put back in the Ringgold Cavalry. So you can imagine being the slow guy. Probably didn't live that down very often amongst your comrades when you came back. I'm sure they were happy to see him. On November 5th, 1865, they decided to move on Blues Gap, which is a decisive training camp for the Confederate soldiers. They maneuvered the bridge but found trees closing the gap, and as a result, they retreated. So in the second attempt at Frenchburg was November 13th, 1861, and this is the one that becomes where Corbett, we know that he's here. And we know that he's here. Henry A. Myers takes 24 Ringgold Cavalry, accompanied by the Washington Cavalry, and moved towards Frenchburg. Several had made it through the pass prior to town. As you have studied that area below the high school, you'll notice that it's rock and rock. It's hard to, once you get into the pass, you're kind of trapped, and that made fighting here, a bit more, made it tougher than open field fighting. When they had made it through the pass, they heard gunfire, and as a result of the gunfire, Private Drum was shot in the head. Hartranft, which was another soldier, didn't realize that he was dead, jumped from the horse and placed Drum's body over the horse of another rider. So we're going to rescue him. He remounted and went back into fire the trooper who was carrying Drum's body and the horse were shot out from under him. So Drum's body's on the ground the second time. The gentleman who was carrying him's horse is shot. As Hardcraft, who went back to get Drum for the second time, was carrying him to his brother, who was also part of the unit, was shot in the head. They become the first two Ringgolds to die during the cause. As a result, their remains were taken back to Bellsville, escorted by John Elwood and the brother, the Drum brother, and were buried side by side in Bellsville Cemetery. The interesting thing in the reading in all three documents, it indicates that they were buried in metal caskets. That it was the Ringgold's secret handshake that if their brothers had died at war, they would be buried in metal caskets. And so both of them were sent back to Bellsville. The Ringgolds themselves paid the difference of the cost of a wooden versus a metal casket. It was November, but they were escorted back. The brother, of course, to grieve the death of his brother, and then they returned back to Romney, back to the unit. Corbett's horse, however, was shot. And one of the things that you can do today that makes things a little easier, and because that thing's not working, we can talk about this stuff. You can request, and one of the things that I did, very hard to do today because we're still under a government shutdown, which has held up some other research on this project that I can't get, is you can request a full military record for a Union or Confederate soldier. This is John Corbett's official record, 36 slides. Nobody really knew he was here until you start reading this record. And it says November 13, 1861, between Romney and Winchester on the Northwestern Pike, John T. Corbett's horse was shot.
What?
He's here.
I got a question about that. You had told us earlier that they were not actually part of the Union Army. How are they in the record?
Okay. The officer would have submitted this, okay? But as far as there is no original enlistment in 1861 on here. You see what I mean? There's no document of an original enlistment. There is of the re-enlistment, but you can go down through it. The other thing that must have been interesting about this horse is it must have been a pretty good horse because it was appraised at $125. And his equipment was appraised at $8, which would have been his saddle and his gun, where he probably had his gun, but his horse was shot. And as you'll go through here, you'll see where they do about every 2 months. They pay them, their wages, and anything that's discrepant, they'll relist. So you'll see for like 5 months, John Corbett's horse was shot, and John Corbett's horse was shot. They just kept re-entering it, I guess, until he was paid for it. The other thing that's interesting in this is that there's some other information that will come along, is that he was paid so much a day by the government for the use of his horse. 40 cents.
Make it worth his while.
Yeah, so he was getting paid, the government was paying him for a horse they didn't have to buy.
They didn't get mileage.
And you'll see where he's paid for that horse,
Probably a
which
good
puts
equipment.
him
A good equipment.
here
Yeah.
in Romney. It puts him at the Battle of Frenchburg. Lost a horse. Now how do you get another horse?
You go home.
You go home and find another horse. You steal one, you're going to find a horse. In his case, he probably ends up buying one because it's not the first horse he's going to lose in the war. They get paid, and it'll say in there, as we get moving further along the John T. Corbett line, where we owe him so much bounty, for things that he's picked up along the way, and as a result, he's trading out other things. This is an incredible document. So if you have any Civil War, it's $30. Takes about 8 to 9 weeks. because they have to dig it all up. And it will tell you everything about your soldier that they have on record.
What's the website?
This is in the National Archives. If you go to National Archives Civil War Records, it'll come up. It's there. At first I thought it was a scam because I didn't get my records. They took my money, but I didn't. And the thing about it is they only take your money if they find something for you too. They hold your credit card. Well, I kept waiting and waiting for this big package to show up in the mail. I was so excited, nothing happened. I finally called the office, and the lady says, "Those are all digital. We sent you an email, blah, blah, blah." Well, fortunately, they sent me the email of all these records scanned in, and it went into my trash. Lucky my trash didn't dump. The lady was wonderful. I was waiting because I thought I had requested paper record, which is nice now because I can print as many of them as I want because it's on my computer. Nice. But it tells me everything step by step on every 2 months. This is going to answer a lot of questions about the relationship that Gertrude Poling has with John T. Corbett, because it's going to put him at certain locations, all right, because of things that happen in his life. All right, anybody have any questions about this? And you can look at it. You know, if you feel obligated to shoot a picture, go ahead. You know, don't feel bad. It just costs $30. Welcome to history, right? History's mystery is how much does it cost?
And when the royalties start coming in,
Yeah,
you never
right.
worry about that.
Yeah. So, and again, if this was up here, I could show you that exact slide because I cropped them all out and put them up on there. Let's turn this thing back on and see if it comes back to life. So Blues Gap becomes the next one that the Ringgolds are involved in. Obviously, we don't know if he got a horse back by January, probably so. You know, they handled horses by the thousands and moved them. I'm sure he got something, hopefully something that was fast. The rough terrain of Hanging Rock, for those of you that Hanging Rock, again, there's lots of hanging rocks in Hampshire County too. We should change all of their names for the purpose of research so that any rock that hangs out over a roadway was called Hanging Rock. Again, the Ringgold Cavalry victory here, as they were able to acquire food, wagons, and resources. It's one of those things that got under Stonewall Jackson's fingernails. You know, it was one of those battles that the Ringgolds were involved in the Gap. It took them a couple times to actually get through the Gap, but when they did, they were able to gather quite a large detail of bounty. They found, however, from a Union perspective, that the Southern soldiers were very poorly trained and lacked discipline. It was at that point that General Landers began prep of the town for an evacuation. On January 10th, the Ringgold and Union soldiers left Romney on their way to Patterson's Creek. It was there that Captain Henry Myers was swept out from under his horse. General Landers becomes one of those interesting figures as you read about him. You know, very headstrong. He actually ends up dying here on Hampshire soil. Later, not very much longer, I believe in March of '63. At Patterson's Creek, the waters were up. If you've ever, I lived in Fort Ashby, so the waters go up and down very fast, and they're very swift. It's a straight channel through Patterson's Creek, and Landers was pushing the soldiers to go across the stream, and when they did, Myers goes under, and the horse goes under, and luckily he was rescued. So it was one of those headstrong parts of it. French's Station becomes the next stop along the way. And French's Station is February 5th of 1862. And I will say that at this point in the war, things get a little gray amongst the books of how they moved. And I think that's understanding the terrain. Did they go out over Jersey Mountain and down into Bloomery? Did they go out through Paw Paw and back through? You know, all those little areas start to look alike and start to acquire the same names. They left Patterson's Creek. They moved down the railroad crossing over the South Branch Railroad. That's where the South Branch Railroad Bridge, which is where the South Branch dumps into the Potomac. That bridge is, one of those bridges is still there. And on to French's Station. Their attempt failed to intercept Loring's army retreating to Winchester. On February 6th, the Ringgolds made their way south to Romney. with Captain Keyes and Company A with the order to burn the courthouse and the jail and the bank. This order, however, was not carried out. Reason was the surrounding houses in town would burn to the ground because of the extremely high winds. I like that too, but I also like the fact that who lives beside the courthouse? Gertrude Poling lives beside the courthouse. Somebody was out there talking to the men in blue saying, hey, you don't light this baby up because the whole town's going to go up in smoke. And this is the part that's the non-documented history. And what I really like about... I have a book listing? No, it's underneath. What I really like about this book, anybody read this book? It's sold by the Fort Mill Ridge, I believe. It's a very reasonably priced book. This is all fact. Like most of this is all fact with no romantic side at all. Okay? So if you're into the fact, this is an excellent book. It's The Devastating Hand of the War. It's written by Richard Sowers. It's an easy read. I mean, my high school kids could probably read this without much trouble and be able to understand it. It's a very good book. And it's a very good book to match up to all these other books, like Barr's book that's... There's a lot of romantic things in this book in terms of how the war was fought. But what I like about this is the cut and dry part. But from my perspective, what I like is, here's a courthouse, here's a family that lives next door who's the jailer, whose two sons are fighting for the Confederacy, that have a daughter that's pleading for this town not to get burned to the ground.
And these were Confederate units that were going to burn?
No, Union
okay.
Union Myers, yeah. The Ringgold Cavalry comes into town, and it says that they visited with their old friends.
How much time had he spent here before that incident?
I have the days.
They've come and gone.
Come and gone. It was like 3 days, 4 days, and then there was shed a little light after hunting up old friends. On February 8th, the additional troops headed to Paw Paw. They went to Bloomery. They worked south of Paw Paw to the forks of the Capon. They constructed a bridge with wagons so they could get across the high sweeping on February 14th. And on March 3rd, General Lander died in that area. And on March 5th, his body was loaded at Paw Paw and was sent to Washington City to be buried. Kernstown, and these are bigger battles, and again, I wish you could see the pictures. I'm just going to touch on some things as we go through. If you could see Strain's painting of the Kings of Kernstown, you might get the idea of how things might work. You got Union soldiers being watered by Confederate Army. You got, it's a beautiful painting if you ever get a chance to see it. Things got very confusing and began to overlap on March 14th. There's several facts do arise, however. According to Dobbs, on March 1st letter stated that his company had just returned from a 3-day scout with a visit to Romney. So that tells us that, okay, we're spending a little time in Romney. They occurred in the Shenandoah Valley. I have some really good friends that live in Mount Jackson area of Virginia. And it becomes the first major battle of the Ringgolds with Turner Ashby. There's a beautiful painting that Strain did called Apples for Ashby. It's a young lady with apples, and she's handing them to him. Apparently he carried an apple in his his satchel as he was traveling. In Romney, April 24th and to the 28th. So now we're going to be here for about 5 days. The Ringgold Cavalry was requested back in Romney upon the request of General Kelly. On the 28th of April, they left and reported to Cumberland. What might 4 days of rest look like in Romney? Yep. Well, they probably, at that point in time, who knows? I mean, you're here for 4 days. Now, what I'm doing is I'm creating the how did he get married to Gertrude Poling part. What did you do for 4 days while you were here? Yeah, I mean, you know, and the other thing is, does every Union soldier and Confederate soldier that fought in the war have gray eyes? I read 800 hospital cards, and every single, about probably 90% of them have gray eyes down. I don't know what that means, but there must have been a lot of gray-eyed people. And Corbett, if you look at his discharge paper, it says gray eyes. So it must have been something about the gray eyes and the dark hair. By May 1, General Kelly ordered the Ringgolds back to Romney, Blinker's division. They stayed till May 10th. The Ringgolds broke camp and moved to Cumberland. 9 more days had passed. So they have 5 days and 9 days spending some time in Romney. The Ringgold Cavalry would be gone from Romney until September. And again, I wish you guys could see these pictures.
You want to try computer one? Can you try?
I am source.
Okay, wait. No, go back. Now, go up to computer one. There, and click on that. Computer one. Can you get up there? And then
It's searching, but it's not. Let me try something real quick. I'm going to restart my computer and bring them up together. Sometimes these older machines have to think about that. Anybody have any questions? What time is it?
Did you mention Dobbs earlier? Was that Auger Dobbs?
Arguner, yeah, the author who wrote the diaries that they translated.
That's really good. That's a good one. Yeah, Dear Esther. Yeah. I don't think that's in, it's called Dear Esther, and he since passed away. I did a book show with him back in the 90s. Can't even think of his name.
Frank Hall.
He's in that book.
Frank?
Yeah, Ralph Hawes.
Ralph.
He's in that book. He has a book of his own that's really good that I've tried to get too.
Yeah. Fantastic book, but
Yeah, I've tried to get a copy of it, but
yeah, I've got a copy, but
Was it letters to his wife?
yeah, Dear Esther.
How
Yeah.
sweet, I bet you
Yeah.
that's nice.
Yeah, it talks a lot about Romney and the people.
and it highlights these battles too, which is kind of nice in terms of.
He stayed with the Montagners while he was in town.
Yeah, he gave them nicknames, did he not?
Yeah, it doesn't say Montagners, but when Ralph and I were at the same book show, I had the 1860 census with me. He had the first names and the names of the children in the book. I had the census, and we matched it up to the Montagner house.
Because I wrote that. That's on one of my slides. So he stayed with them when they got a little laxy. They didn't have to stay in the camp. He
Right,
paid them
yeah.
50 cents a week for food
Yeah.
and board.
Yeah.
It's documented in one of these.
And was that the house stand that we still call the Massacre?
I would think it would be.
All right, we're going to try this. It's restarting. I'm going to turn that off, and we're going to restart this and hope that it comes back up. Yeah, rather than at camp, Dobbs stayed in the home of Busby and paid 50 cents a week for food and good.
Yeah, Mr.
Busby.
But there's
And there
another
was
one.
an unmarried daughter, or sister.
There's another reference to staying with a family in there. It didn't mention them, I think, a name, but that's what it was.
So one of the things we can move through this because the part that becomes more interesting is about to happen, and hopefully that'll come back up. You know, one of the things they had to do was to feed a lot of horses too, and the trains, the forage trains, were very important to the survival of the Army, especially in the numbers that they created around New Creek, etc. I will go back for a second to that battle at Blues Gap. There are some references in the book, and I didn't bring this up, about gluttony of the soldiers. And Dobbs alludes to that in one of his letters to his wife, where they had turkeys and geese and all kinds of food strapped over their saddles, that their horses were struggling to get back to town, that they had looted and stole everything they could get from that camp. They got on that horse, and you know, the soldiers were coming up out of Blues Gap, and Dobb said that, you know, he had to get out of town quick. He didn't have time to get bogged down by all the stuff that some of the other soldiers were taking from that camp when they, you know, finally broke through and got out. And this, for me, from an animal science perspective, is interesting. You know, Greenland Gap becomes a major target on October 27th, 1862. This kind of gives you an idea of the amount of things that they can gather quickly. In that battle, they captured food, guns, ammo, 24 horses, 75 cattle. Like, I don't know if anybody in here has ever tried to move 10 cows, but 75 that have already been under gunfire, those were the 75 that, you know, were the calm ones. The other 150 took off in the mountains. But, you know, and the other part is, what do you do with the cattle once you get them? Well, they're going to eat them, you know, and many of these farmers, you know, they had open butcherings, and many of them were pumped onto trains and off to bigger cities like Washington, and where they could be processed into food. But, you know, when you're hungry, we're butchering, you know. So in the midst of all this war and bouncing around, you know, and the picture that I have is a wonderful depiction, you know, of a Union soldier camp butchering. And it shows them tying the cattle up in the trees, and, you know, you've got to eat. The other thing is, it's going to spoil if you don't eat it all. You know, so some of the cattle had to be fed and managed until it was time to eat them. You know, I mean, it's like modern day farming and 1860 style. You know, you got to hold them back. The horses have to be fed. So one of the things you're going to find to be very common here in this specific area is the foraging training thing. Being able to go out and find the hay that's needed to feed horses. And the Ringgold Cavalry, we'll talk here in a second, you know, had a collection of, you know, 10 wagons that were stolen at one point. That's a huge number. I mean, these are big wagons, 4-horse wagons that were stolen, you know, by the, by the Confederate, you know, Rangers that were here. When you lose that much food, you got to make it up somehow. And so you see a lot of that occurring here in the South Range Valley. In itself is a wonderful piece of history that we don't really, we talk about the battles and the shooting and who died and whose horse got shot and who lost their rifle and who, you know, doesn't have a saddle. But we don't talk about how do we feed these people. And I think that's a phenomenal, you know, in the South Range Valley, you know, is like it is today, you know, in most cases. It was an area of good grass. It was an area of good farmland, fertile farmland, so there was hogs. I mean, there was one reference to 115 hogs. I cannot imagine moving 115 hogs. I had a hard enough time with 10 in a building, let alone moving hogs, you know, in masses to feed people. The winter quarters in Romney, you know, that becomes in itself, and this is where we allude to them living in the homes. I did have a chart here of an actual picture of what a winter fort might look like. My best, you know, description of it would be they would take wood. And create a log cabin effect at the bottom, get it down below the frost line, and that's important, which here is what, 36 inches is the frost base. That's where they would build houses so that the foundations don't crack, but they would get down into the earthen base and build a wooden structure, and then put their canvas tents on top, and line them up in a way in which the snow wouldn't, you know, drift and go into them. You know, and that takes time. Takes a lot of time. December of 1862, you know, we have, you know, back in Romney in terms of winter quarters, December 12th, the Ringgolds reported to Romney. The men at that point in time quartered in abandoned houses. So you can imagine December 1862 coming in off of a horse into a house that hasn't been heated for a month, 2 months, a year.
Like sleeping outside tonight.
Pretty much. I mean, it is going to be terrible type living condition. What I can say is in December the 18th, the telegraph was completed to Romney. The wiring was completed to Romney, which is an important part of the communication process. People of Romney were friendly and happy to see the troops, and they appreciated the return to order. I'm sure when there's soldiers around, things seem to happen. Some men remained in town, and that's the reference to Dobbs, Auctioneer Dobbs. Stayed at the house of Busby. Again, he paid 50 cents a week for food and a good bed to sleep in. Was John T. Corbett at the camp? Those are the questions that you have to ask. And when you have that freedom of movement, it's cold, nobody wants to fight, nobody wants to do a whole lot, that leaves time for cards and talk. February of 1863 is an important part of the picture for Romney and the Ringgolds. As we talk about a wagon supply train, the train was gathering hay along the Patterson's Creek Valley, which would have been Burlington all the way up through, again another fertile area. And the horses, again, they were ambushed on their way back 5 miles out of town. At that point in time, we're looking at this guerrilla type behavior of the McNeils and that attack and function. But what's really interesting about this specific setting is the different behavior comes out. And that is that, we're going to untie the horses, we're going to take what we need, and we're going to let the soldiers go. We don't want to be burdened by getting you to Harrisburg and sending you off to a Civil War prison. We're going to let you go. And that becomes a different point of view. However, the McNeils turned in 105 horses and mules in Harrisonburg, Virginia. So it was a pretty good collection. But they didn't turn loose. I mean, that's a lot of stuff. At that point, the wagons from the Ringgolds I just mentioned, actually 8 wagons, were taken. Of those wagons that were harvested by the McNeils, that's 32 horses. It's a pretty good loss. Not to mention supplies and food and hay and things that were in those wagons. However, this is the interesting point. It was found in 2 different books, not referencing each other. However, they borrowed wagons from the locals till January 25th when they obtained their new wagons from the government. Back to what Dan had to say about that, building a relationship with the people of the town. And, again, the last thing they want to do is give up their wagon. That's their mode of movement, but they also don't want to give up their liberty, I guess, in terms of that either. I mean, there are alternatives, but in both of those references, it indicated that they were borrowed, not taken as property. And I'd have to look back to see if they were indicated that they were a one-sided book or not, because there are some one-sided books. Borrowed, or the borrowed is the Union version, the Confederate version is they stole the wagons from the local people. So you have to watch how that's printed. But and again, that's an indication of the show of the people. One of the things about 1863 in March, that's where we started to think about, Yankee Ford and the building of the trenches. Becomes one of the more severe and excessive rain winters that we had here. Very cold, lots of documents of excessive amounts of snow and rain. The soldiers started to wear down. It's a grudge match. It's like a mud battle every day. It's cold. It made the work very tiresome. On March 17th, they began the road work to the trenches, up to where, we see them today. It was finished in June, so April, May, June, in 3 months to build a road. Imagine trying to build a road up that rock bar and mud from down in the stream bed, the South Branch deposit. That would be an excessive job to do. One of the things about that is, in April 6th, there was an unauthorized foraging train that went out. And at that point in time, McNeils takes advantage of that by watching that train again, and they end up cutting off the supplies and releasing the horses again. So let the horses go. We don't need them. We don't want to manage them. We don't want to deal with it. We want the supply load. We want the guns, etc. On April 7th, as we look at the Ringgolds retaliating on that, they spotted the enemy and set up artillery and shelled their camp. Again, this is the Battle of Purgattsville up through Moorfield. April 25th, Lieutenant Myers went on scout with the Ringgolds. They took pursuit of a possible enemy and later determined it was a mail carrier. You know, that's the thing about it, is from a distance you can see a large group of people moving by horse, but you may not know by their clothing if they're Union or Confederate. In this case, they started chasing the mail carrier from New Creek. And as a result of that, ended up getting caught by the McNeils on the second fact. I will bring up a battle in Moorfield, just because I think it's a good point, and for my friends that live in Hardin County, they would want me to do this. As far as a Ringgold soldier, Private Henry C. Slusher, in the research, on September 11th of 1863, the attack was made on Cemetery Hill in Moorfield by the Confederate Army, and they gathered up everybody by wagons. The Ringgolds are traveling by South Fork and hear that this has occurred, and as a result, you know, they found out there were 146 prisoners were taken in the Battle of Cemetery Hill, and they were headed out towards, from what I can tell, out towards South Fork Road, and the Ringgolds intercept them. William Hagner was in an ambulance, having been wounded, who's one of the soldiers from the Union Army. Henry Slusher saw him from a distance from across the river. He swam the river through the bullet fire, and he got wounded to get to his wounded friend. As a result, he was captured and shared the remaining days in prison, lived in prison until the war was over, with William Hagner. For his valiant effort in trying to save his comrade, he was bestowed the Medal of Honor, being one of the only Ringgolds to have been given that honor. His medal actually hung on his tombstone. His granddaughter went to visit him and found out that the medal was loose, so she pried it off of his headstone, and there was a huge controversy in Washington County that someone had stolen his Medal of Honor. When in doubt, it was his granddaughter who took it and preserved it, and she still has it in Kentucky today.
Nice.
But a Medal of Honor recipient in the Ringgold Cavalry. You would have fought, you know, with Corbett here and the crew, you know, who, you know, put his life on the line and ended up being in prison. So another, you know, unique point we don't, you know, always think about as we go through that. What I can say after that, however, is that John T. Corbett's battle is going to get really thin. Because according to his military record in November of 1862 to February of all the way through, I have this wrote down, it's isolated on there. I have all these cards, but he and apparently pretty sick because he ends up being moved to the USA Hospital in Cumberland and then on to Claryville. According to the records, it will show. The first slide that I had up there was the muster roll for the actual 22nd Pennsylvania Cavalry Ringgold and the corresponding USA Hospital census, and you can see that they match directly. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you what he's in that hospital for. I can't tell you if he was shot. I can't tell you if he had an injury. It said due to illness. Well, that could be a whole wide array of things. And that's where I mentioned previously that I couldn't get to the archive records because of the government shutdown. You know, because of this, this opens up a whole new can of worms. Because now he's in a hospital for a considerable period of time. You know, and how does he build this relationship with this girl from Romney if he's in a hospital? And we're talking he's going to be in there until he goes in November of 1863, and he's in that hospital until May of 1864. Okay? So he spends a considerable amount of time in this hospital. Now this is where things get a little interesting if you want to know about people. I went to the Civil War Roundtable, and some of you in here are members of that, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in the Civil War, to join that organization because it's a great way to get information back and forth. Steve French wrote this book, Phantoms of South Fork, and I went to one of his presentations, and you know, I know that he'd worked with some local historians just to get some insight on what I was doing with this project. So I called him up and said, who knows anything about Claryville Hospital? Well, immediately it goes ding, 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 call these 3 people. And I did that. Called George Fletcher, was one of the first phone calls I made in Cumberland, and he says, well, you know, you need to get a hold of Steve Moreland, he has a book. I'm like, Steve's from my own hometown, why don't I not call Steve? You know, this is how things, you know, people and information gets moved around. One of you mentioned, did you ever meet the author of this book? This is another great book. The one that I really want is the one that I had to order, which is the book that he wrote about the Clariesville and Cumberland hospitals. He wrote a whole series of them.
Roundtable still has some of those for sale.
Yeah, Harold Scott was a historian, history teacher, I believe, was president of the Round Table. This is actually Steve's book. It's a good book, Steve. I haven't bought mine yet.
Don't
Steve,
forget.
don't forget that that's your book. As soon as I get another one, you can have this one back. I think I've got what I need out here as soon as the archives open up. But there's a section in this book that covers Clariesville Hospital because of the amount of time and energy that Harold Scott put into that. It's in this book, and many of the historians of Civil War history have contributed to this book with Harold. It is a great book, and it's not unreasonably priced either. You know, it's always good to have a resource to be able to pull information from. So what I did, went to the Civil War Roundtable, had a discussion. Who's been here before that knows anything about Clariesville? And this person did a great presentation, but they're now passed away. God, that library burned to the ground. You know, and that's what they say when somebody passes away. The library burns to the ground. You can't call them up and ask them anything anymore. And that's why it's so important to put things in print and get it proofread so that people like me who get crazy about something can go find the information that they need. Writing a book, talk to Dan, you know, it's probably not the easiest thing he's ever done in his life, but I don't think he'll regret it. But, you know, so I start the conversation. So one of them said, well, there's a bunch of documents out at West Virginia University. I said, really? I said, how do I find out about those documents? So what they are, and I copied some things to show you. I went there to find John Corbett's bed card, okay, because I didn't know what he was in the hospital for. And I was told that there were 842 of them, original bed cards for Clariesville Hospital, and they're on the computer. Talk to the lady, she said, you come out and we'll set you down and you can look through all of them. I don't have anything else to do with look through 800 cards.
I hope we can hear you.
Huh?
I hope we can hear you. Back to the
So the cards are there. I'll turn that. There's 800 and some bed cards. So I'm getting really excited because now I'm going to get to look at a document that's different than this.
So those bed cards are specifically for John Corbett?
Not specifically for him, but soldiers that were in that hospital during the time that Corbett is there. Okay?
So you may actually get to see his medical card for why he's there.
Yeah, and that's why I went. Okay? So I show up, it's in the library downtown in the back in the regional history section. If you've ever been, it's a beautiful part of the library. So I go in, I said, I'm the guy from Romney. I called ahead so you guys could have this microfiche or film ready for me. I'm really excited to look at John Corbett's, see if I can find my soldier in the book, in this group of documents. And so I go in. She says, well, the computer's not working. And the lady looks at me and goes, are you trustworthy? I said, ma'am, I wouldn't have drove 2.5 hours and carried these 5 books up these steps if I wasn't trustworthy. Okay. She goes downstairs and brings the originals up.
Wow.
And sets them on the table. And I hand went through every single one of them. Now, I may get typhoid, because it might still be on the cards. Because I asked the lady, do I need to wear the white gloves? It's like CSI stuff. You're in a room, can't take any drinks back there. It's climate controlled, leather top, just like the Library of Congress. She's like, no, you don't have to wear gloves. I'm like, my fingerprints are all over 800 Civil War cards. probably the coolest thing that I've done, I've done some cool things in my life, but to sit there and go through those 800 cards, incredible. So incredible that I've inspired some kids at the high school to take those 800 cards and categorize every single one of them by how old are they, what's their disease, what's their hometown, what's their regiment, what's their race, were they a northern or southern soldier, all of those things. Can you imagine the amount of information you would be able to pull from those cards? What they are is they are bed cards from July of 1864 to July of 1865. Went through them all anyway. My guy wasn't there.
He was out now.
Wasn't there. What I can tell you though is when you pick up an original medical chart, because there's about 40 of them, full medical chart, and you're able to read, this is a soldier who was wounded in the Battle of Cedar Creek on October 19, 1864. Was shot in the right arm. Here's his whole medical record. Even the fact that he died, and that there was an autopsy performed by M.M. Townsend, who was a doctor in Frostburg, who's one of my bottle people. M.M. Townsend's hay fever extract is sold worldwide.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? M.M. You took that, right? As a kid? But, and when Scott wrote the book about the hospitals, he didn't know anything about these cards. Because they were just recently given, from the doctor who was there, his personal collection. He took them. When they closed the hospital, he loaded up whatever was there. That would have been the end of the hospital. The other thing that you'll find as you move through them is you'll find that there were African American patients. This is Simeon Davis from Pennsylvania, single, Greene County, from White Cottage, Pennsylvania. It tells you everything about them. That's why I wanted the card. It tells me their hometown, it tells me everything, even more than the regiment does. This is an actual card, because you can pay 10 cents a piece. So for $80, you can have the whole collection copy for yourself if you want. That lady there probably be a little upset, but it tells you under there exactly what they were, and then on the back, if there's any medical cards, they'll copy them for you. The other thing you'll find in that hospital are Confederates. This is a Confederate soldier. Typhoid, chronic rheumatism, and typhoid fever. It's all listed right there.
What was the average age kind of?
I went through them so quickly that didn't stay in long-term memory. And that's the part that I think is so valuable about those cards, to be able to take them. If you have 80 kids, each kid does 10 people, you now have everything categorized. You can look at anything you want.
Is that
With
being
the push of
done?
a button. Huh?
Is that being done?
I don't think so. And if it obviously we'll find out if it has before we do it, but, it's one of those hidden kind of secrets that through word of mouth, this collection exists. And had I found John Corbett's bed card, I would have been probably doing a hat dance around the table. Because now you have something. This isn't a copy. This isn't something the government sent me. This is the real deal. And I will tell you the other reason that I go there is there's this thing called the Battle of Timber Ridge. It was on June 6th of 1864. And he was shot there.
Where, Timber Ridge Road?
Timber Ridge out in Moorfield, going between Williamsport and Moorfield. He was shot there and was sent to the hospital. That's the reason that I went. And they started July 9th. He enlisted in the hospital on June 6th. That was a month off. Less than 100 cards I would have been right in there.
I wonder where the other cards are.
Probably got burnt, thrown away. That's all that the family has is those specific cards. But, what powerful stuff to be able to look at and to endure. It's crazy.
How did you find out the bed cards were at WVU?
Just in conversation, George Fletcher and I were talking back and forth. I pounded around Clariesville on the computer, and up it came. I said, "Is this legit?" And and it gives you the ranges. And what they are is they're bed numbers, and they're numbered by bed number. So as they came into the hospital, they were given a number. So if he got there on the 12th, his numbers was in the box before. He's that close, you know. And we know he got shot, but we don't know where. That would have told you exactly where. There's only about 30 of these original. There's an autopsy that was performed. Please understand medicine in these days. You know, there were 70 some individual soldiers that died at Claryville, and autopsies were performed with local doctors. It was a quest for learning. So, I mean, this is an actual report of an autopsy of what they found. There's 2 of them, actually. So, that's in 1964. So he misses a lot of things going on. So we're talking in the hospital around November, does not get out until April of 64. All right, so I can talk this one from memory because I know where we are in terms of transverse this enough. So the next major battle that we end up with that shows up in the end of April is, did he get put on light duty? Only one source has this, and I had been told from sources that you have to watch the Elwood Stories book because there's a few discrepancies of different things. This is the one that got me the most excited because it was the first piece of John Corbett data that I found. They were retreating with a wagon train from Romney. Corbett was at the back of the train with no guard. So we're talking 10 or 12 wagons, maybe more. Corbett's with the prisoners at the back. Okay? They're headed down out of Romney. McNeil's Rangers figure out, hey, there's no rear guard on this guy. There's nothing, all of our prisoners are in the back and there's no rear guard. So they take off chasing the train. At this point, Corbett's in the back. He has a prisoner by the name of John Fay. I don't know if you've studied history or not. Okay, he was from Cumberland. Fay was the one that set up
He was their spy.
the spy to get the generals out of the hotels. The cool thing about this is I can't wait to have a conversation with John Paul Strain and say, John Paul, and he did some work on some art for me. I love his work. You painted John Fay 3 times. Are you interested in painting him again? At the Wire Bridge in Springfield? Because according to the documents of Elwood Stories, and it was republished in this book, which is the William Moffat book, which is another common Ringgold name. They were headed across the Springfield Wire Bridge, and the McNeils come up from behind. One of the soldiers recognizes Fay immediately and takes off blasting guns. At that point, prior to that point, Fay apparently, for some reason, talked Corbett out of his horse. Said, man, this is really, I gotta ride. It's April, it's hot, I need to ride. So, or due to the injury and illness that he just got out of hospital with, he got shook up and needed to walk. One or the other. Fay's on his horse, Corbett's walking. Guns are blazing, Fay spurs him, takes the horse. Corbett runs off in the brush and escapes being captured in April. First part of May. It's documented in both those books. Now, could you imagine a painting of that wire bridge with Fay up on Corbett's horse with his foot? And, you know, of course, he painted Fay here at the courthouse. Painted Fay coming into Cumberland. He painted Fay with Jesse McNeil visiting the Belle of Cumberland with the train, and those 3 paintings. So, do it one more time. You know, put Corbett in the painting with that bridge, which would be really cool in terms of the history for our area. Again, I can't find it in Farr's book that there was a skirmish by the river. Nobody says it. Elwood's book says it. The original one says it, and you can look in there where Gertrude Parker highlighted the information in this book and circled the storyline in this book. So, you know, again, is it a romantic side of war? Is it, you know, a story that was told? Is it the right soldier? Not sure. In the record, it does not show that Corbett was compensated for a stolen horse. What we can tell you, however, that within 2 weeks, at the Battle of Timber Ridge outside of Moorfield, between Moorfield and Williamsport, which is on Patterson's Creek Road, the Battle of Timber Ridge, John Corbett was shot and his horse was stolen or shot. He lost them both. Those documents show up a couple different ways. One of those is in 1866 on the report of the war, is one of those cards. It indicates that John T. Corbett would not be compensated for the horse that he lost on June 4th, which tells me that it was a government horse. It was somebody else's horse. Because, you know, we know later that Gertrude Parker was compensated, you know, for her husband's service in the military through some records. But he would not be paid for the loss of the horse at the Battle of Timber Ridge. And he was sent immediately back to the Cumberland hospitals. He was captured, was paroled, and was taken back to Cumberland. And he would stay in Cumberland until November. So June to November. It's a good chunk of change. And the June bed card is the one that I wanted, because it would tell me exactly where the injuries were. Shot in the arm, shot in the chest, shot in the leg. All those things would have shown up. The really interesting twist to the story is he spent all of that time in the hospital, September to April, out in May to go get on the bridge and get shot. Goes back to the hospital till November. Guess what happens in January? January 2nd, 1865. They got married in Cumberland, Maryland.
We know the answer, right? From when he, this is what you spoke about earlier the other night, am I right?
What's that?
What happened on January the 2nd?
Yeah, he got married to Gertrude Poland.
To Gertrude Poland from beside the courthouse then, right?
What's that?
Who lived beside
Who lived beside the courthouse. So, picture in your head for a second, this is the one that's got me the most puzzled about who the volunteer workers and nurses were in that hospital. He was in that hospital from September to April. That's September of 63 to April of 64. He went back to the hospital in June and was there until November of 64. He gets married on January 2nd. What did I tell you about J.W. Poling at the beginning?
He was born in Cumberland.
Who was that?
When one of the Polings born in Cumberland?
Yeah,
Had
Crescent
family?
Town.
Yeah.
So,
He was visiting. She was over there sparking and visiting relatives.
can we prove it? Sure. I mean, those are the things that make this story so interesting. You know what I mean? That's what makes this story so interesting is, you know, you have that time spent in Romney. But here's the other thing that's interesting is she is married as Poland, P-O-L-A-N-D. The clerk of Allegheny County gave me a citation with their marriage information on it. And it's Poland. It's a misspelling. But it is him for sure because of the other information. So, yeah.
I know in some of the Confederate hospitals, a family member had to go to care. And there really weren't a lot of nurses and staff to care. You think maybe she came over to care for him during all that time?
Well, that's what I'm hoping when the archives open back up from a government
Be a
shutdown.
caretaker.
We're making history tonight. We're talking about government shutdown, but hopefully her name will show up there because it corresponds to when he's there. The other thing about Clary'sville I didn't tell you is that's a 1,000-bed hospital. 1,000 beds, 6 wings, 150 feet long. It's on the way from Cumberland on the old road on the left. When I was a kid, it was called Scampi's. You went there and ate seafood, and it burned. The original part burned, but they built these long row houses. I can tell you. Where's my book? But that's a 1,000-bed unit. So one of the things that they did note in the reading is that they were taken care of by their other soldiers too. The community members there came around and did things as well, so on and so on. So, but let me see if I can find it. But yeah, Claresville Hospital. Here's some original pictures, but just kind of to give you an idea of how big it is. The size of the facility holds 1,000 patients, 6 wards 150 feet long, 1 ward 100 feet, 3 wards 130 feet. I mean, and it shows you a picture of it. They had a dining room, a guard's quarters, 80 foot of water closets, 8 water closets that were 10 feet long. They had a bakehouse in the kitchen, and again, they had room to do the autopsies and perform surgery. So they drug doctors. Its location made it easy for them to get resources too. And so, but at the end of the war, they sold the lumber, tore the buildings down, and left the main structure and returned it back to the family that owned it. So I mean, interesting stuff there for sure. Timber Ridge, the Cumberland wedding. One of the things about that Cumberland wedding is some of you in here that have looked at the history in more detail would know that on Christmas of 1864, which would have been the 25th of December, there was a unit that came to Romney. The Ringgolds did a scout to Romney. And I wonder what that scout was for. I wonder if it was to pick up somebody who was going to get married. Because one of the things that they documented about that period of time is that the winter was so cold during that time period that the horses that they could not feed were dying standing up. They had muzzles over their mouths so that they wouldn't chew the wood that they were tied to. So we're not talking about friendly stuff. I mean, Cumberland's a lot more inviting than that. The other resource that you're going to want to take a look at in terms of this family, and I've used my 7 o'clock, but is that John T. Corbett and Gertrude Poling get married. They also have a son who was born in 1865. His name is John Paxton Corbett. And that's the J.P. Corbett that you found, who becomes the manager. Him and Mary become the managers of the Parker House Hotel. Because in 1871, Gertrude Poling Corbett married Isaac V. Parker, who was the Confederate soldier, the blacksmith who was the neighbor in the 1860 census. As a result, she ended up marrying a Confederate. The interesting thing about this is she was invited to every Ringgold reunion. And John Elwood mentions in his book that he was a visitor in her home throughout the remainder of his life. And she always had the latch string out for a Ringgold soldier. So she maintained her loyalty. Isaac Parker was invited to Pennsylvania when they had the huge reunion there as an honored guest of Gertrude Poling. Not as, because he was the Confederate soldier on the other side. So he was her guest to the reunion. John Paxton Corbett becomes the manager of the hotel. He is killed tragically in 1898, and I have that resource here if you want to read it. It was in the Hampshire Review on the microfiche by detail. He was killed. They had someone come to the hotel who wanted to fish. And as a result of wanting to fish, JP says, well, let's take a ride on the train. So they went down to the train station, got on the train, headed to Greenspring. That was the transfer back and forth. He said, we'll get off at Vance's Strait, Wapakoma Station, and we'll fish. And when the train goes down and comes back, we'll get back on the train and come back to Romney. Well, apparently they got to doing too much of this, talking in the car, and they missed the stop. And Corbett said, the water's too rough anyways. They passed over the river and got to Greenspring. On the way back, there was a ticket holder, and I mentioned his name, who was supposed to get off at Wapakoma Station, and the engineer did not stop the train. Corbett says, I'll take care of that, and climbs out of the baggage car, climbs up on top of the train, and runs down the train, as they would have done, because he had experience in the railway, because their first two children were born in Martinsburg, Berkeley County birth certificates. where he worked for the train prior to coming back here to Romney. So he knew the train. Well, what he did is he got to the end of the last car and he went down over what they call the hook. And when he went down over the hook, he slipped on the bottom one and fell onto the tracks. The engineer saw it, and the train went up over his limb and up into his torso and cut it. He was loaded on the train. He was taken to the Romney depot station where he lived for 4.5 hours. 2 doctors attended to him. They're listed in the paper. And he dies and is buried in Indian Mound. The thing about Corbett is he gets married. We're talking about Soldier Corbett. We haven't really ended that story. Soldier Corbett, because I don't have my PowerPoint, and we're trying to end it. Soldier Corbett ends up getting back into the military. He dies in the Presbyterian Church on July the 29th, 1865 of typhoid fever, and is buried in Indian Mound Cemetery. I can show you where his grave is. As you go into the Indian Mound Cemetery, right at the entrance, there's a series of Corbett's and Polings to your left. His stone is flat. He's the only Union soldier buried there that we know of during the war period. There is another one that was moved there after the war.
Where did he die?
He died in the Presbyterian Church, which was at Moorfield, which was a Union hospital. My question is he buried in a steel casket?
Typhoid fever, so they weren't married very long.
No, but their son was born that year.
So they conceived a child.
Yes, John Paxton Corbett. Paxton is a Pennsylvania name. There are several soldiers in the unit that are Paxtons. I don't know if I cannot find John Paxton Corbett, the first John Paxton Corbett. I cannot find his birth month or his birthday. And I don't know if that's hidden history. He's not in the courthouse. He's not in the records. I went through everything. I've searched it. His children's death certificates indicate that he was born in West Virginia. There's no record of his birthday or month. We know by his tombstone that he was born in 1865 during the war. So there's a good chance that he never met the one that died in the Civil War, never met his son. Or if he did, as they say, it takes 9 months to make a baby. So if you're married in January, that's only 6 months to July. Okay, that first one can come anytime, the rest of them will take 9 months. Okay, so either they conceived a child at their wedlock and he was born after he died, or she was carrying before they got married and the child was born before he died. Those are 2 questions I can't answer. And I've dug and dug and dug and dug to find it. The other thing about the Corbett that's the pharmacist, when his father dies in 1898, he is born in November of 1898. He is the 3rd son with his father's name. Does everybody get that? He's also John Paxton Corbett, who married Corinne DeBerry, and I can go on about that too.
That's another time.
But that's how the Corbett name ends up in town. But we could have two different instances where they never met their sons back to back because of birth and death.
And the third one was the one who
had the farm. He was also John Paxton Corbett. He is not considered a junior because he's the 3rd son. He was named after his father, who was deceased. So that's the saga of how we get to town. You're welcome to look through all of these documents. If you want something, I can make you copies. He seems like he's making himself at home with Elwood stories over there.
That's a great book.
He'll get it back to you when he's done.
When he gets the other one,
When the binding breaks,
Right.
you give him.
When
When I give his back, you gotta get that one back. Does anyone have any questions? I know we covered a lot, and I hate that the PowerPoint didn't work,
I
because
know, but
all of these things would have been more
maybe you
visual.
can send it to us and
Unbelievable.
somehow incorporate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, you guys are probably wondering why I brought this. This is a Civil War soldier who was a pharmacist in Piedmont. I'm interested in doing some privy work.
Find a lot of them.
Yeah, you do. Lots of hidden secrets. But this guy was a Confederate soldier, Piedmont. He was a doctor there for 5 years. One of his original bottles of 1870.